Good morning. Welcome to week 3 of our Wednesday morning wonders. And as you know, the subjects vary from week to week, and this week is going to be a treat because we have Barbara Oberlander returning to talk about another of the first ladies. She's done a number of them. The last one she talked with us about was during the Depression, of course, as you probably recall, with Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, this is a different kind of first lady entirely, but we'll leave that for Barbara to explain. Barbara, welcome.
Where's the slide? Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, those of you who've come out on this rather rainy day. As you know, I have in retirement talked about a number of first ladies, and I am constantly amazed at their evaluation, the opinions that are written about them, how historians regard them. There is a research institute called the Siena College Institute, and they conduct a rating of first ladies every 5 years or so. They ask historians and political scientists to give a score to first ladies based on 10 categories, including their background, value to the country, courage, accomplishments, integrity, leadership, being her own woman, public image, value to the president. Rosalind Carter, in the most recent evaluation, which occurred in 2020, came in 9th. In other words, she's in the top 10, somewhat at the bottom. Eleanor Roosevelt is always number 1. But I have a feeling that the estimation of Rosalind Carter will continue to go up. She was First Lady only for 1 term, but she made her mark, as you will see. And in the years after being in the White House, she continued to be incredibly active. She was, as I've called her, the perfect partner to her husband, Jimmy Carter. They were both serious. They were both ambitious. They studied Shakespeare together. They learned to read the Bible in Spanish together. They were both very religious, and she supported him always. She was his chief confidant and his chief advisor. They are one of the closest couples ever to occupy the White House. It's also a time, 1976 to 1980, when the roles of women were changing. The women's movement was in full swing. The Supreme Court had handed down the important Roe v. Wade decision. The Civil Rights Act had outlawed discrimination on the basis of gender. And women were shifting their roles. In many ways, Rosalind Carter is an example of that. She was born Eleanor Rosalind Smith in a small town near Plains, Georgia, which was a small town in itself, in 1927. She was the eldest of 4 children. She came from a very modest background. Her father was a mechanic. Her mother was a seamstress. Rosalind made her own clothes. And as far as I know, she is the only First Lady to bring a sewing machine with her into the White House. An interesting story about Rosalind Carter as an infant, perhaps some of you know this. She was delivered by Lillian Carter, who then brought her 3-year-old son over to see the beautiful new baby girl. So if you want to, you can say that the Carters actually met in 1927. Her father died when she was just 14 years old. Here she is at 12. Look at the serious expression, and it's a foreshadowing of a woman who wanted to be taken very seriously. When her father died, her mother received a monthly insurance of, I think it was $8.25 a month, and she worked in a grocery store. She took in sewing. She worked in the Plains post office. Rosalind helped to supplement by working in a hairdresser's shop. As I said, modest, hardworking circumstances. She was an excellent student and graduated as her high school class valedictorian. Okay, it was a very small class. And she thought that she would be a teacher. She went to Georgia Southern College for 2 years. And she had a vague idea of either teaching or studying interior design. But when she was 17, she went on a date with the brother of a close friend of hers, Ruth Carter. And that date was Jimmy Carter, who was just, as I said, 3 years older. Within a year, they were married. Look at this photo. They look like babies, don't they? She was 18 and he was 21. He was a recent Annapolis Naval graduate, so his career as a naval engineer and commissioned officer meant travel. And oh, Rosalind liked that idea. As I said, Plains was a very small town. It had under 1,000 population at the time. Today, I think it's only a little over 500. And she said, quote, "I think I had secretly always wanted to get out." Jimmy teased me about it, saying that was the only reason I had married him. He was ambitious too. And in the early years of their marriage, they had 3 sons. In 5 years, they moved from base to base: Norfolk, Virginia, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, San Diego. And she mentioned in her memoir that she developed quite a bit of independence because he was often gone and she had 3 children to raise. So she had to make decisions. And she liked that. But in 1953, Jimmy Carter's father died. And he decided they would go back to Plains to help to run the peanut company. She was not happy. Quote, "I cried. I screamed at him. I argued. But instead of eliciting sympathy or being persuasive, it had the opposite effect. He had no patience with tears. And he said, 'Rosie, I'm not going to argue about this. We're going back to Plains.'" Quote, I became more and more dejected the closer we got. I didn't want to live in Plains. She particularly didn't want to live next to her very strong-willed mother-in-law. It was not appealing. Jimmy Carter, as soon as they went back to Plains, became involved in local issues. He was on the school board, and by the way, he was in favor of integration very early on. He taught Sunday school. He was very involved in the church. She was very depressed at first, kept to herself. She took dancing lessons, took tennis, but then one day, Jimmy Carter called her to answer the telephone in the peanut warehouse because the person who usually did that had not shown up. And Rosalind went to the peanut warehouse, and soon she was writing tickets for supplies. She took a business and accounting course. She was very good at it. She grew more confident, and she wrote, quote, I loved it. To make all those books balance, it was better than anything I'd ever done. So here begins their partnership. And Carter and his wife working together. It was not a radical idea in the rural South. They helped build the company into a very profitable peanut business. But Jimmy Carter was ambitious. He had a great passion for self-improvement. He learned speed reading. They built their dream house. Within decades, he was a leading citizen, and he decided to run for the state legislature in 1962. How did Rosalind learn of this? He appeared one day in dress slacks instead of his usual khaki slacks. And he told her, I'm going to Americus to file. It was 15 days to the election, and he had just made up his mind, and, quote, I follow along. There was a dogged determination in the campaign. Rosalind called every registered voter in Sumner County. Her ears hurt, her voice was hoarse, her mouth cracked. But Jimmy Carter won, and he was off and running in the state legislature. She ran the warehouse while he tried to become the best state senator ever in Georgia. He was smart, he was focused, he was honest. And next step, run for governor, 1966. Jimmy Carter ran for governor of Georgia. He was defeated. They learned that they did not like to lose. And in 1970, he ran again and won. They had honed their campaign skills. They competed with each other to see who could remember people the best, that not only their names, but something personal about them as they talked to voters. Rosalind was powerfully motivated, and she was good at it. Surprising, it turned out she was a natural at political campaigning. And here they are after Carter is sworn in as governor with Amy, who is the youngest. Carter looks incredibly serious in this photo. Another photo of him. And he immediately caught attention. On the cover of Time magazine, Dixie whistles a different tune. A Southern Democratic, liberal, young governor. Someone who expected to change, bring a lot of change in the state, in state politics. Somebody who was honest, who said he was above corruption. Suddenly, Democrats were interested in him. And he, as I said, was ambitious. He had his sights set on the presidency early on, and he wrote a book about himself. Why not the best? There looked like there might be a chance in 1972. If you think back to 1972, Thomas Eagleton was removed from the Democratic ticket after it was revealed that he had undergone psychiatric help. But it wasn't Jimmy Carter's time. 1976 was different. There was a long, long campaign in the primaries. He might be well known in the South, but not in the rest of the country. And in fact, when he told his mother that he was going to run for president, she asked, "President of what?" You know, she couldn't conceive that her son, the peanut farmer, was going to run for president of the United States. But think about 1976. It was an extraordinary time in terms of presidential elections. It was post-Watergate. It was post-Vietnam. Americans were disaffected with politics. It was the time for someone to be an outsider to Washington politics and to run on that campaign. Can you imagine a surgeon telling you, "Well, I'm inexperienced, but I'm the best"? Jimmy Carter was saying, "I'm not part of the Washington crowd, and my inexperience is an advantage. It's a plus." So unique circumstances probably led to Jimmy Carter's election. But everyone agrees he wouldn't have made it without this woman who was on the campaign trail. She was very good. Jimmy Carter could give speeches that almost sounded as if they were coming from a preacher. They were full of morality and they were very, very serious. But she was down to earth. She was feminine. She was strong. She was funny. And she humanized him. She was better at this than he was. And one political scientist has said, this shy girl turned into, quote, "an independent political operative," unquote. She would go into radio stations unannounced and say, "My name is Rosalind Carter. My husband is running for president, and I think you should talk to me. I have come with a list of questions you can ask." And that's what she did. She had a script, and she went from radio station to radio station. Here she is, campaigning in Tallahassee in 1976. Jimmy Carter was not threatened by her ability. He told Meet the Press, quote, "She has even a better awareness of people and issues than I do. She's there. She's more intimate with the average voting citizens than I am." He heard her give a stump speech in Virginia, and when she was finished, he rushed out, kissed her, and lifted her up. He was so impressed by his wife. And here they are after receiving the final news of Carter's victory in 1976. And there they are with the Fords. Jimmy and Rosalind coming in, and Gerald and Betty going out. And Betty Ford was a hard act to follow, believe me. Here's Jimmy Carter sworn in as president, January 20th, 1977. And you all may remember this. They insisted on walking down Pennsylvania Ave on Inauguration Day. No more pomp and circumstance for them. There they are. And of course, there was a lot of talk about Rosalind Carter's inaugural gown. It was the same gown she had worn when he became governor of Georgia. She was not concerned about clothes. She was not concerned about shopping expeditions. Here they are. It was kind of different to have such a young child in the White House. Amy was about 9, and they announced she was going to go to a public school. She had very clear ideas of what she wanted to do as First Lady. She was not interested in the ceremonial role. She was not interested in picking china. She was not interested in decorating the White House. She had serious things on her mind, and she wanted to be taken seriously. I think she's the first lady to come with a briefcase. She had a briefcase, and she made sure her staff was going to be regarded as professional. Hers is the first fully staffed office of First Lady, and she wanted Congress to recognize that. It was important to her. She expected to be a full partner. And here she is, sitting in on a White House briefing. She and Jimmy Carter would meet for lunch at least once a week. She would come with her list of priorities. He would discuss events with her. And he said, quote, "There's very seldom a decision I make that I don't first discuss with Rosalind." He was asked about foreign policy, and he said, "Oh, well, I confirm my foreign policy decisions with Rosalind, Cyrus Vance, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and finally, Hamilton Jordan." Now look who was first. Above the Secretary of State, above the National Security Advisor, Rosalind Carter. She was there all the time, his confidant, his advisor, the person he asked about policies. Rosalind Carter was a supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment, and here she is with Betty Ford. And she attended the International Women's Conference in Houston in 1977. But her primary focus was mental health. You are going to see a 50-plus year crusade by this remarkable woman to get the country to pay attention to mental health issues, to get rid of the stigma about mental illness, and to have people treated fairly. This is where it began. Jimmy Carter had a cousin who suffered from mental illness, and Rosalind Carter remembers being somewhat afraid of him when he was back in town, and he was in and out of this hospital. This was the major psychiatric hospital in Georgia. In fact, it was the only one. And it was infamous. Beautiful building, but don't let that fool you. 13,000 patients. It was the largest institution in the United States. The ratio was like 1 to 100. The kinds of things that went on in this institution in the early years are beyond description. Children kept in cages, people treated with shock therapy, cold water baths, nausea-producing drugs. It was unbelievable. There had been an expose of it in 1959 in the Atlanta Constitution. The series won a Pulitzer Prize, and various people after that had tried to do things to make it better, including releasing patients and putting them in community facilities. That was one of the things that Rosalind Carter was interested in. She spoke constantly at conferences on mental health. It was her passion. You know, when Jimmy Carter ran for governor, people would come up to her and tell their stories about trying to care for someone in their family. And she wrote about being at a factory one morning, and a woman who looked exhausted and tired came out and spoke to her and said that she and her husband had a mentally ill daughter, and they were caring for her at home, and there was no support. And so they worked alternate hours at the factory, and the woman was coming off the night shift. Everywhere she went when Jimmy Carter was running for governor, people came up to her and told personal stories. And she put that together with what had happened to his cousin and what she had seen, and she embarked on this crusade. Here she is chairing a meeting in Chicago, and then testifying before Congress. Carter had set up a mental health commission, and she was the honorary chair. They prepared this enormous report and proposed legislation that would increase funds tremendously for mental health research and also set up community-based clinics. She testified about it in Congress passionately. It was the Mental Health Systems Act, which was finally signed into law. Look how late it is in the Carter presidency. Rosalind was impatient, angry. Why didn't this get through Congress sooner? She thought she could propose the legislation, the commission could present it, and it would go through. But that isn't the way it works in the American political system. And so finally, it was passed in 1980. But unfortunately, when Ronald Reagan came in as president, most of the funds were cut, and it didn't get full funding again until much later. But this was an issue that she wanted people to talk about. The very first press conference she had as First Lady, the reporters from the Washington Post asked her about her decision not to serve hard liquor in the White House anymore. They called her Rosé Rosalind. And she was very upset by that. Why are they talking about wine? I want to talk about serious issues, the mental health crisis. And it was that way a lot. She couldn't understand why people refused to take her seriously. You know, the reporters followed her on a shopping trip in New York, and to her, this was just a side thing that she did. The real issues were ones she cared about. Jimmy Carter sent her on a Latin American tour in 1978. She went really as a presidential envoy. She prepared for it by learning intensive Spanish 3 hours a day over several weeks. She read volumes of briefing books on the history of the country she was going to visit. And she spoke about it when she returned from Latin America. Now, she visited 7 countries in the Caribbean and Latin America, Brazil, Jamaica, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru. She bypassed the traditional circuit that first ladies did when they visited foreign countries. That meant visiting schools, visiting orphanage, visiting hospitals. No, this woman sat in briefings and diplomatic talks with the heads of these states. And when she was asked about it by the press, because she wasn't appointed officially, she hadn't been elected, she didn't hold a cabinet post, she said, quote, "I am closer to the president than any other person." Now, there was a mixed reaction to her, as you might imagine. Much of Latin America had kind of a macho theory about women's place, and this was a woman stepping out of that place. But she did it, and when she came back, she briefed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on her return. Generally, there was a favorable media coverage. The Chicago Sun-Times said, quote, "First Lady Rosalind Carter is making America proud. She has succeeded almost to perfection." On the other hand, the Chicago Tribune writer mentioned that he helped Jimmy Carter would stop using family members as ex officio representatives of the American people. Even Meg Greenfield, in a Mrs. President article, commented, if she wanted a diplomatic role, she needed to find a way to be more accountable. But these were substantive talks that she carried on with heads of state. And Jimmy Carter appreciated that. And in general, our relations with Latin America seemed to improve. She also went on traditional kinds of foreign tours. Here she is in New Delhi, in a refugee camp in Thailand in November of 1979. Welcomed by members of the Thai military as she arrived at an air base in Thailand, and she came back with the sense that there had to be better efforts for people who were in refugee camps. And then, of course, there's Camp David. Rosalind Carter was there, and she was an important advisor again to her husband. In fact, her notes about the meetings between Sadat and Begin at Camp David cover 200 typed pages. She played an important role. Jimmy Carter ran his thoughts by her. Quote, "Rosalind was a partner in my thinking throughout Camp David negotiations." A photo of Begin and Sadat as the Carters watch. The peace agreement between Israel and Egypt was in many ways the high point of the Carter presidency. Here they are in 1979, but 1979 was not the best year. Remember this? Over 50 Americans taken hostage as a result of Carter's humanitarian gesture of allowing the Shah of Iran to come in for temporary asylum and medical treatment. It was a nightmare. in so many ways. The fall of 1979 was one the Carters would like to erase. Gas prices went through the roof. There was inflation, there was unemployment, there was the hostage crisis that was on the front page every single day. Carter gave a famous speech called the Malaise Speech, in which he talked about problems with the United States and the world, and it wasn't really what we needed to hear in the fall of 1979. And so we come into the 1980 election. Rosalind Carter campaigned around the country. Jimmy barely left the White House. He was occupied, preoccupied, focused on the hostage crisis. And she was his designated voice around the country. But in a sense, that wasn't good because her strength contrasted with his weakness. This is a wonderful button, Rosalind Carter, for First Lady. And of course, you know the 1980 election results. Ronald Reagan swept into the presidency with huge numbers. It was a landslide. Rosalind Carter was shocked, absolutely shocked, that her incredible husband had not been elected, had been rejected by the voters. She blamed the Times, the whole thing, on what was happening in Iran, and she said, quote, "I am bitter enough for the both of us." People who have written about her have said that they only saw her angry a couple of times, and this was one of the points. But the post-White House years for the Carters are very interesting because they reinvent themselves. Now think about it. They were only in their mid-50s, an ex-president in his mid-50s. Most people don't even think of running for the presidency until they're much older than that. The first thing they did was to establish the Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia, which, as the motto says, was interested in peace, peaceful elections, fighting disease, and building hope. And the Carter Center was enormously important in fighting diseases that had ravished much of Africa. Here she is in 1993, and here they are in Ghana in 2007 to see the Carter Center progress against guinea worm disease and trachoma. They practically eradicated guinea diseases, which had been one of the scourges in Africa. Here they are in Nigeria, visiting children with schistosomiasis, again, one of their targets. Very important work. They received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Bill Clinton at the Carter Center, partially because of their work. Jimmy Carter himself received the Nobel Prize in 2002 for his work in peace. And of course, I suspect all of you know that Habitat for Humanity was one of their favorite projects, and they built together or helped to build over 4,000 houses, not only in the United States, but around the world. Within the last decade, continuing, think about it. They were in their 80s working on a Habitat for Humanity project. And mental health. You didn't think she was going to give up. She wrote a book in 1998 called Helping Someone with Mental Illness. It's an incredible book in which she talks about not only prominent figures in the United States, people on television, actors and actresses who were afraid to admit depression or problems with mental illness. She talks about stigma and how we looked at mental illness. In many ways, how we used to look at cancer, don't talk about it. We don't want to hear about it. She talked about the problems trying to convince towns to have houses for people with mental issues instead of leaving them in a too large institution. And the book was translated into several European languages. In other words, its impact was international. Here she is, again testifying before a U.S. House of Representatives committee. She was lobbying for a Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. Essentially, this would be an act that would have mental illness covered by health insurance, just the way that physical illnesses are. Here she is at a rally for this. It did get passed. Another book in 2010, Within Our Reach, Ending the Mental Health Crisis. She received so many awards for her work on this. The American Psychological Association, various health institutions. She was so ahead of her time in taking on this as a cause. And probably this is one of the most important. It's from the World Health Organization just 3 years ago. The Director General's Award for Global Health in recognition of her contribution. There they are together, holding hands, of course, in the Carter home. That's the Carter home in Plains, Georgia, a rather modest house. And as I'm sure you all know, Rosalind Carter passed away in her late 90s this past fall. This is one of her great-grandchildren. The Carter family grew enormously. There were about 40 members, sons, daughters-in-law, great-grandchildren, grandchildren. This is what she said. I had already learned from more than a decade of political life that I was going to be criticized no matter what I did. So I might as well be criticized for something I wanted to do. A great statement about her years in the White House. You must accept that you might fail. Then if you do your best and still don't win, at least you can be satisfied that you tried. If you don't accept failure as a possibility, if you don't set high goals, you don't branch out, you don't try, you don't take the risk. She's talking about her crusade in the field of mental health. She was going to take that risk. So, what have people said about her? I was intrigued by this column that was in the New York Times after she died. Rosalind Carter and her aides ran a powerhouse at a time when women's political participation in formal politics was just emerging. If she wasn't beloved, she also wasn't deeply polarizing. More important than any measure of popularity, she managed to achieve her key goals. It's an interesting comment because very recently there was Apple TV and Showtime did programs on First Ladies, and they omitted Rosalind Carter. they focused on somebody like Betty Ford, who's a much more colorful personality, you know, and gregarious, and someone that's fun to talk about, a different personality than Rosalind Carter. So Rosalind Carter was sort of pushed to the background. But Jonathan Alter, perhaps in death, Mrs. Carter will finally be properly appreciated for her role as this country's premier champion of mental health. It's only one of the many unheralded accomplishments of a formidable and gracious woman who belongs in the first rank of influential first ladies. I admire her. I admire her tremendously. I admire her for her growth, her evolution from a shy country girl into an incredible political campaigner. I admire her for what she contributed to the field of mental health. I feel very strongly about this, and her accomplishments are enormous. There's no doubt about it. I admire her partnership with her husband over what, almost 80 years? She was his confidant, his advisor, his sounding board, and she absolutely belongs in the rank of our most important first ladies. I give you Rosalind Carter, the perfect partner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara. Just wonderful, as always. Any questions or comments on Rosalind?
Thank you, Barbara. That was, as always, a terrific talk, and I remember some of this quite well. One of the things that struck me, my husband and I and some friends visited Americus and also Plains, Georgia, many years ago, was that the community apparently showed up at the little train station where Jimmy was, after he was elected. And I got the sense that the community, even though it might have been kind of stifling for Rosalind when she was growing up, it was also a tremendous source of support. Could you comment on that?
Yes, thank you for your comment, Lynn. That's absolutely true. Well, he was very much embedded in the community. You know, he taught Sunday school, and they were both very faithful Baptists, and Carter loved to teach Sunday school, and he did it well into his later years, and the community was very proud of him. You know, he had served in so many capacities, school board, state senator, all kinds of things. It was a very, very supportive community. She just didn't like the small town atmosphere.
Okay, Barbara Francis. One group that the Carters established was called Friendship Force, and it was a people-to-people travel group. And my sister and brother-in-law in Milwaukee were quite involved with it. My brother-in-law was president of the U.S. chapter at one point. And so they had dinner with the Carters when they had their national meeting. But they went to places like Korea and Turkey, places that the ordinary person wouldn't go as a tourist. And they would not stay in a hotel, they would stay with a family. So they had one-on-one conversations with people in these other countries, and then they would reciprocate. And so they hosted people from these same areas. And I think not many people had heard about that chapter in the Carter's life.
It makes sense, doesn't it? It's very much in keeping with them. They were definitely people persons, in terms of establishing relationships and all that. I have very good friends from Gainesville who actually went to Plains, and who showed up when they were taking the tour, but Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, and invited them to come into their house and see the Christmas decorations. And there's actually a photo of them with the Carters that I just couldn't get onto this presentation, but they were very impressed by their warmth and kind of down-to-earth atmosphere. Yes.
So, some of you will remember Lamar Miller. One of Lamar's favorite stories was that when they were stationed in Washington, Jimmy Carter was president. Lamar was the Sunday school superintendent at the First Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. And periodically, Jimmy Carter would come and teach that Sunday school class while he was president. So Lamar's favorite story was that at those times, Jimmy Carter was working for him.
Yeah, he loved teaching Sunday school. As I said, their faith was very important to them and sustained them when they had losses or problems. There's no doubt about it. But they were very down-to-earth people. I do recall going through Plains at one point when my husband and I were traveling in Georgia, and there was Amy on the street corner selling lemonade. I thought it was perfect.
All right, we have a question on Zoom. Good morning, Phyllis. Go ahead.
Hi, Barbara. So enjoy your talks. And I've learned so much from you now on Rosalind Carter. I just wanted to note, we also had contact with the Carters, or at least with Jimmy, in about 2009. Arthur and I were on a Delta flight from Atlanta to Barcelona, Spain. And who comes walking back from first class but Jimmy Carter, shaking everybody's hand? And it's really amazing, because when Arthur and I first married, our first argument was political. And I voted for Carter. He voted for Reagan. But at any rate, he was delighted to see Mr. Carter. And then when we flew back to Atlanta from Barcelona about 10 days later, who was on the plane but Mr. Carter, walking down the aisle, shaking everybody's hand. That was one of the high points of my life. Thank you very much.
Yeah, he was informal in one-to-one contact, not necessarily what you would expect. So I'm not surprised at that at all.
Neil Holland said, a question about their children. What has happened in terms of their children going forward? Have they been active and involved, and what?
There was one son who ran for the Senate in, I think, Nevada, but he was defeated. And so their children have been involved in other kinds of things. Amy is on the board of the Carter Center. You've got businessmen, computer people, but no political legacy, really.
Barbara, I seem to remember that his brother, Billy, was that his brother? Was kind of a drag on the reputation of the family. Do you remember anything about that?
Yes, I guess every family has one person who doesn't quite fit in. And there was a problem with Billy in terms of drinking and all. I think they were embarrassed by that. But one interesting thing was during the Iran hostage crisis, Billy had contacts, I think it was Liberia, and they tried at some point to use him to work with his contacts to get the hostages released. And of course, that didn't work and it was bad news. Yeah.
Any other questions? This has really been delightful. Well, one more.
I think it's important that their work in the world has continued with their, gosh, I
Yes.
can't think of the name of their organization now. What is it? That provides so much support.
The Carter Center, perhaps. You know, some people have said that he was such a successful ex-president. He should have jumped over the presidency and gone immediately to being an ex-president. It's interesting to look at what presidents do, but of course, he had 40 years ahead of him. And both of them were active until their 90s when other issues set in. So it's kind of remarkable to look at his post-presidential accomplishments. That, are you thinking of the Carter Center?
I think it's probably the Carter Center. Yeah.
Habitat for Humanity is still, yes. Yeah.
I don't know whether he started Habitat for Humanity, but he certainly supported it, didn't he?
He supported it, yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you all. Have a good day. Stay dry.
Thanks again, Barbara.
That
Now,
worked.
next week, as you know, with the Wonders, you get a little different serving of entertainment and knowledge each week. So next week, we're going to be talking about the role and the presence of dinosaurs in Antarctica. Should be fun. See you then.